Before launching his career as a novelist, our next guest had a distinguished career in the music industry where he served as a special advisor to AOL and was the executive vice president at the Warner Music Group. Now he writes spy thrillers, and his latest book, The Matchmaker, just hit bookstores. Paul Vidich, welcome to Thriller Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, Paul, before we get into everything else here, as I just noted, you had like a heck of a career in the music industry. So when did you know that you wanted to be an author, and what finally made you take the plunge?
Well, I actually was an author before I was a music executive. And like so many people, you find that you got to have another job in order to pay the bills. And I also wasn't confident enough about my writing that I could say, okay, I'm going to do it and then hope for, bestsellers. So I went off, I got an MBA. And as things happen, I was actually very good at my job and got to a very senior position, but I had never forgotten my initial interest in writing. So I made this contract with myself, a promise to myself that when I was financially able, I would leave my career and pick up where I left off. So I left my job at Time Warner, got an MFA to match my MBA, and then I started writing. And I was a little older than a lot of debut novelists. I think I was 65 when my first novel came out, which is put me in a slightly different category. But I've been very prolific. Now that I look back, I say, well, I've published 5 novels in 5 years, and that's a fair number of. That's a little work, actually.
Mhm.
Definitely something to be proud of. And also, Paul, I'm always a big believer. The more life experience you have, the more richness you bring to your stories, to your characters. So I think you hit it right at the perfect time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I do have the 2 novels I wrote in my 20s, and they're terrible, and largely because they didn't have a life experience. And I was trying to write things, but there wasn't anything beyond the words or underneath the words. And I did have a lot of life experience that really taught me about, you know, the things that I write about, which is betrayal, love, treason, vengeance, which happen to be the things that spy novels rely on in order to tell a nice, provocative story. And I guess the other thing I'd like to say is that I've never worked in the CIA, and I get this question sometimes. But what I say is that I worked in a bureaucracy, which was Time Warner. And CIA is also a bureaucracy. So I knew enough about the way organizations work to be able to inhabit the minds of the characters that I'm writing about. I had it was interesting because about 5 days ago, I interviewed with David McCluskey, who has this wonderful book out, Damascus Station. And before
Yeah.
the interview, we talked about the fact that he was in the CIA, he was an analyst, but his views of what happened in the CIA as a bureaucracy were identical to my views of what happened in Time Warner as a bureaucracy. And so I felt I could easily inhabit the minds of the characters I have.
I love that approach. You're right. Whether you're civilian or government, it has a lot of similarities. So in Matchmaker, I was so excited that you explored the real life Romeo program because I've read about it before, targeting vulnerable West Berlin women. So can you share maybe a couple of interesting facts you learned about the operation from your research?
Yeah, it was so the principal research I did, or I did a lot of research for about 5, 6 months, but the book that sort of stimulated my interest in that program was the autobiography of Marcus Wolf, who was the head of Stasi counterintelligence, a brilliant man in many respects, and and a man who was admired by his counterparts in the CIA and MI6. And so that's sort of the inside dope on spies. They know who their adversaries are, and they either admire them or they don't. And in this case, Marcus Wolf was much admired for the novel ways that he went about doing tradecraft. In his case, he turned what spies have always used, sex as tradecraft, and he turned it into love as tradecraft. and he developed um, East German young men, spies, who he sent to the West, who looked for vulnerable women. Maybe they were lonely, maybe they had drinking problems, maybe they had money problems, but they tended to be people who worked in a government agency or had access to some intelligence or some sort of secret material. And then they romanced those women, and in many cases they married them. And these women didn't know that they were being used as covers for their husbands' spying. And when the GDR fell and all of this was revealed, many of these women had, this sort of horrible, tragic wake-up call that the man that they believed was their husband was also a spy who may have had another family in East Germany. And when I came across that, I thought, that's a really interesting premise for a novel. Spies are all about layers of lies and deception. And this is one where it's not just lying to people without a consequence. It's lying to somebody who emotionally you're attached to. And I really was interested in Anne Simpson's reaction to discovering this, because it's sort of it's a pretty profound discovery.
It kind of makes you wonder too if couples actually might have fallen in love for real, which I think, right? Because if you're living with someone and pretending to love them, sometimes that becomes reality.
Well, in fact, they did. I did follow the lives of a couple of these women, and there are three examples. One woman discovered that her husband was a Stasi spy and confronted him, and he killed her. And he made it look like it was a burglary. In another case, the BND, which is the German police, arrived to arrest the woman because she'd been, considered to be an accomplice, and she committed suicide, jumping out the window. And the third had grudges against her boss. And when she discovered what she was doing, she became her husband's collaborator, working alongside him in order to get whatever secrets they could get and pass them on to the Stasi and then on to the KGB. And Berlin and West Germany, East Germany were really the front line of the Cold War for many years. You had the Allies there after World War II, and then you had the divided city of Berlin, then you had the wall. And so it was really, there were spies everywhere, which is sort of why I, took this story and placed it in Berlin, because as Nikita Khrushchev said, Berlin was a swampland of spies. And so if you're writing about spies, you're wondering where your next book is going to be set, Berlin is an obvious place to consider.
Well, Paul, one of the things that's always struck me is how well you research your novels. And it got me wondering, like, what is your writing process like? So are you an outliner? Do you sit and outline and figure out all the twists and turns ahead of time? Or do you just sit and crank these things out? And how much research do you actually have to do before you can start writing?
I do a lot of research. I sort of start with this inchoate idea, where is this book going to be placed? And I almost invariably start with place, setting. And in the case of Berlin, it's sort of an obvious choice. I look for the things that go into what makes it interesting for a spy to be in a location. And then I start doing a lot of research. It's usually reading books by, in this case, ex-Stasis or by victims of the Stasi. And I read a lot of books about the fall of the wall. I have probably 6 months of extensive research, probably 30 books of some, not necessarily the entire book, and enough so that I inhabit that moment in time. So I know the city as if I'm living there. It's not like I'm creating a travel log, but I know the city from the point of view of the characters I'm creating. And in the process of the research, I develop, the characters, and I create dossiers on the characters so I can inhabit their minds. I know where they were born, what alcohol they like to drink, what alcohol they don't like to drink, and whether they're Quakers or Catholics. All those little things that you need to have in the back of your mind when you're beginning to write, so that it comes out almost naturally as a part of the story or the character. When I have all of that, then I begin an outline, and I end up with a chapter by chapter outline, which generally follows the path of the plot. And when I have all of that, I get very uncomfortable and I begin to say, now it's time to write. The research is over. Research is comfortable, but nobody wants to read your research. So you sort of have to put the pen to paper. And then I do a lot of drafts, and the drafts generally come quickly. My drafts, first draft, which I write in by hand with a pen, is about 45 days, maybe 60 days. And then one draft leads to another. And generally, before I type something up, I've got 3 or 4 drafts done. And in the process of writing the drafts, I really discover this whole other part of the novel, which is the things that surprise you, that a character does almost naturally. And then that becomes the way that the novel begins to take on a life of its own, and the characters begin to sort of be free agents. And so the outline is there sort of as a guardrail for the impulses that come out of the characters. So generally, I end up where I began. The ending that I had outlined is the ending that I, end up with. But along the way, there are a lot of surprising twists and turns, character-driven.
I love that. It sounds like structure with a bit of freedom, a perfect balance.
That's perfect. That's exactly what it is.
And I love well-researched novels, because to me, when I read a book, I really like to be entertained, but also educated. So speaking of which, which authors influenced and inspired your writing the most?
Well, of the spy novelists, Graham Greene, who wrote many things beyond spy novels, has always been somebody I admired. His use of language, his word choices is just brilliant. He's and Le Carré, I love, and some of his books are a little ponderous, but some of his books are really beautifully done. I think of Spy Who Came in from the Cold. Eric Ambler is a great writer, and I was influenced by his book, A Coffin for Demetrios. And of course, then there are all these other writers that I love, Homer, the Bronte sisters. I love good writing. I love good stories. I happen to have chosen to write spy novels, but I love great literature. Of current writers, Joe Cannon is a brilliant writer. I'm a big fan of his, and he has a way of creating characters through dialogue and with quick brushstrokes of the pen, saying something about a character that allows you to understand who that character is.
I totally agree, by the way. Joseph Cannon's a favorite of mine. He's a really interesting guy to talk to, by the way, as well. He's absolutely brilliant with how he, I won't speak for him, but the way he puts his plots together, he's just a brilliant guy. It's really fascinating. It's super underrated.
Well, he and I have lunch occasionally. And so it's fun to have lunch with him, because we talk about how we write, what the stories are, and it's so two writers getting together and talking. It would be great to have a microphone at some point. But
yeah, certainly.
And in fact, he has a book coming out, I think in 10 days, February 22nd, called The Berlin Exchange. I have not read it, but when I saw that he and I both had books coming out in February set in Berlin. I said, Joe, we should write a piece and we should call it Why Berlin?
Right.
And and that's coming out in Crime Reads sometime in the next 2 weeks. But it was an interesting conversation because so many writers have chosen Berlin as a place, whether it be Le Carre or Len Deighton. It's the place, as Joe says, that's where the spies are. So that's where the writers of spy novels go. But it's a wonderful conversation about what it is you look for in a city. How does a city become a central character in a novel, going along with the characters themselves. So it's always fun to to talk sort of the craft of writing
Mhm.
with him.
Well, out of all the books that you've written, is there one that stands out as the most challenging to complete, and why?
Probably my third novel, The Coldest Warrior. Um, it's in some ways it was the I was closest to it because the original story was the story of my uncle Frank Olson, who was murdered in 1953, and I knew the story well from the inside, from the point of view of a nephew and the family tragedy that ensued. And I tried to write the novel a couple of times, but I failed because I was too close to the story. So, but I had a character, this person in the CIA who does highly classified bioweapons work, who has moral qualms about his work. But he can't talk to his wife about it, and he can't talk to his colleagues because to do so is a little bit of a betrayal. But so he's lonely, and that character became George Mueller in the first novel. And it was only after I had done two novels I could go back to this story of Frank Olson and write it from a different point of view, distance myself from the personal stuff and make it a sort of a murder mystery in a way. And and so it took a while to get to a place, but I think ultimately it was successful, and it got very nicely reviewed. It was nominated for a couple prizes. And it's a big theme, the big theme of, um, when do the requirements of national security lead to the breaches of what we consider to be our sort of domestic principles?
Mhm.
And that's a story that never ends. Because that's a conflict. The the CIA is charged with giving intelligence to the president of the United States about um, foreign threats. And when you find these foreign threats, sometimes it's important to violate your principles in order to protect them.
Mm. Yeah, well said. So going back to, you know, your background in music, many talented authors feel that stories and words have an inherent rhythm to them. Do you feel that background you have in music helps you creating lyrical prose?
Not well, maybe. I mean, music. I don't listen to music when I write. Some authors do, um, but I do. I do listen to the words that I write. When they're coming out, I do try and give sentences rhythm, make them a little musical, make word choices lyrical. And thanks for making making that point because I sometimes uh, find that I'm not sure people really recognize the lyricism in some of the writing, but it is definitely something I intend to do. I mean, I love Shakespeare, and one of the things about Shakespeare is that it's all lyrical. He uses words and puts them together in ways that are just magical. And yet, when you read them, you're sort of reading for the content. It's only when you reread them that you think about the lyrical quality of the words.
Mhm. Well, you do a fantastic job of it, and people are noticing.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Well, if you were to write something other than an espionage thriller, what would it be?
It would be obviously character driven, but I I choose themes that are sort of dramatic and yet poignant, and I'm not sure I would write a novel that doesn't have some element of spying, thriller, sort of political elements to it. I mean, partly because it's sort of the world we live in now. And I admire a lot of literary writers who deal with sort of personal, issues in their lives. But I'm somebody who looks out at the world, and I see the world, and I want to sort of reflect on the world. And so I I've I've got a couple of novels that I'm thinking about now, and I just get drawn into the political environment, or the novel I'm doing next actually moves from the Cold War to the War on Terror, which is something that we're living with and have lived with for the last 20 years.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. And I'm with you. I'm a bit of a spy thriller fan as well. Did you grow up on James Bond, or was it like who influenced you movie wise?
Uh, I guess the films that influenced me were some of the noir films. The Third Man
Mm,
is this brilliant movie. I thought the James Bond movies were wonderful entertainment, but they never really left me sort of thinking about the movies afterwards.
agreed.
Whereas the Third Man definitely has that sort of resonance. And it's sort of movies like that that really sort of made me think about the world. As an auteur, Hitchcock was always my biggest. I was a big fan of his, and North by Northwest, which I recently re-saw, happens to be a spy novel. I mean, a spy picture, which I didn't realize because I never thought of it that way. But the main character, Thornton, I think, happens to be a media executive, advertising executive in New York City, who's mistaken for a Russian contact. And then this movie that was done in the mid 50s, in the middle of it, you see these men who are said to be CIA officers. And I thought, how did I miss that the first time I saw it? But it was interesting because in the mid 50s, CIA was really not well known at all. It was a pretty secret organization, and it became a public organization only in the early 60s as a result of the Bay of Pigs and other things. So to have this reference to the CIA in North by Northwest, I think it was done in 1955 or 6, was sort of pretty unusual. But again, that's a wonderful movie. It's a little bit like an Eric Ambler because it's sort of the innocent man who's wrongly accused, who has to sort of prove himself innocent by finding the guilty. And that's a great trope that is used in a lot of places.
So, that old adage about I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time because a lot more time to write shorter pieces than longer ones. You've written a lot of short stories. Can you kind of describe what that experience is like versus writing a novel for you?
Short stories are hard to do because you have to understand everything the story is going to be about before you begin writing. It's a little bit like the Hemingway comment that a novel, what you see on the page in the novel is only about 20% of what the author needs to know in order to write the novel. Everything else is sort of background and understood. And the characters in that short story have to be like that. They have to have sort of inhabited all of this background before you, the reader, can feel like you understand who they are. Um, so I was a short story writer before I started writing novels, and I liked some of them. Some of them won awards. None of them had to do with spies, however. So, and the other reason I got into writing the novel, the first one, was because of an agent who read one of my short stories. It had won an award. He liked it. And he said that we don't represent authors who write short stories. So do you have a novel? And I said, looked at my wife and I said, well, the only novel story that I have is this story about my uncle. But you really, short stories are this wonderfully sort of contained world, and it requires a lot of attention to read them, not just to write them, but to read them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I recently wrote one myself, and I was like, "Geez, this is harder than a novel. I'll take the novel."
Right, exactly. The novel, you have a story you can follow, so you know what the story is going to be, and there are plot points, and there's chapters and development, and you can, and it's a lot more forgiving, because you can get stuff wrong, and people are still enjoying the overall story. In a short story, it's very unforgiving.
Yeah, I totally agree. By the way, I'm working on one now, and I feel like can't waste a single word compared to full length novel. But so, Paul, what advice do you have for new authors or writers looking to publish their first works?
Be patient. Be patient with yourself as a writer. Be patient with the ideas. Be patient with the story. Don't try and force it. Just look inside yourself. Figure out, try and discern what it is you want to say, and then proceed. And there was at business school. There was a professor of mine who taught a class, and I don't even remember what the class was about, but he said something that stuck with me, and he said that patience is the sign of genius. And I've sort of lived with that notion that you sort of have to be patient with your ideas, patient with your writing, and if you are, good things will come out.
That is absolutely excellent advice. I love it. With respect to your extensive and varied career, which moment is your proudest?
Ah, you mean my writing career or my music career or
Either,
any career?
yeah, or you could do both, either, yeah, or one, yeah, whatever.
Well, I I'm very proud of what I've been able to accomplish as a writer. Um, and and then you own yourself as a writer. It's not like a music executive. I would go to a corner office. People would call me. I had all this sort of, to some extent, cachet, celebrity. Of course, then you leave, and that's no longer you. The office is there. Your title is gone, and the what you were is theirs, not yours. And being a writer, you own who you are, and that to me was always a powerful thing. But having said that, I think one of the things I was proudest of in the music business was when music industry was going through Napster. This is 20 years ago. And Steve Jobs and I managed to negotiate a deal, the first deal in the music industry that created iTunes. And he was a disruptor. And within the music industry, as the senior guy at Warner Music, I was a disruptor. And we got together, and the rest of the music industry sort of reluctantly followed our decision, but did follow. And then that sort of changed the music industry, because it was iTunes that sort of took off. The CD had already been declining, and then out of iTunes came the streaming world, and now the world of music is streaming. And so it did lead me to believe that single individuals can have, an impact in the world, whether it's somebody in the CIA, somebody in the music business, somebody, as a writer.
I love that. It's sort of like a legacy of sorts you leave as a writer because, like you say, it's you. It's very personal and it has longevity. Whereas I love what you said about when you leave your position, that all changes. You don't have that anymore. You have it in your past and in memories, but it's not you anymore.
Yeah, and I saw it. I had bosses, CEOs who were my bosses, and over a course of 4 or 5 years, I had 4 or 5 bosses, and invariably they were fired. Not They didn't leave on their own. And it was interesting to see what happened when they lost the office. They no longer had the private jet available to them. They no longer had the chauffeured cars. They no longer had the big salaries. They were no longer treated with the sort of the required respect. And in one of my books, I have the same thing happen with somebody who's very senior in government who gets fired, and it's like you suddenly you can't dress up the same way. People don't look at you at the same way, um, and it's sort of just an interesting observation that I could only have turned into sort of an aspect of my novel if I had lived it. So this is again back to your point. When you're a young person, you don't have all the life experience that sometimes is helpful to have when you're writing a novel.
Mhm. That's great. So before we wrap things up, we just wondered if you could dive into, you mentioned the next book, A War on Terror and Endless Combination. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's set in 2006, um, in Lebanon, in Beirut. Uh, in August and July of 2006, there was a 34-day war between Lebanon, Hezbollah, and the Israelis. And my novel takes place in that 34-day war. It involves Hezbollah, involves the CIA, Mossad, and it's told from the point of view of a young woman who's a non-official cover agent, a Muslim American, um, and I have had a lot of fun with it because it's a young woman who's the protagonist. She's Muslim American, Lebanese, and so I deal with a lot of things that I haven't dealt with before, and so it's been fun to write. Right now it's with my writers group, and it'll soon be with my agent, and then we'll see what happens next.
That sounds really intriguing to me. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot for joining us today. Such a pleasure to connect with you. Uh, really respect the way you approach your writing and your passion for the spy thriller, which is one of my favorites as well. And we'd love to have you back on when the next one comes out.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time and your support.
In the meantime, I hope everyone goes out and gets their copy of The Matchmaker.